super excited. What actually surprised me was how many resources my classroom actually had. I think the narrative about urban education, what we see in the movies is that you're going to walk into this building and there's like no technology, you don't have enough chairs for your students. And Atlanta Public Schools is actually quite different. This is when smart boards first came out, so I like had this brand new thing that I definitely didn't have when I was doing my student teaching in Indiana. And there was just an abundance of technology. But the flip side of that is I taught at Slater Elementary. Anybody familiar with Slater? Okay, yeah, Southeast Side, Carver Homes. My children, though, when they left that classroom, the resources that they had when they left were non-existent. They didn't have a lot. We were one of the poorest schools at that time, and maybe still in Atlanta, and so there was always this tension of, I have all this great stuff to deliver information to my students, but when they go home, they don't always have everything they need to come to school in the right state of mind to receive that information. And that's something the tension that I've struggled with as I continue to do work in education, because I can go into a classroom and coach a teacher and be like, okay, you can do this, 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 and this, but what do we do when our kids come to school unprepared, tired, had to walk, they just changed schools because they got kicked out of their apartments? And those were some of the issues coming up for me that I just found it really difficult to approach from my position as a teacher.
And I asked that question for a reason, because we're going to come back to that, because all of this kind of ties in together. So I want to talk about this report, To Atlanta's. What did you all set out to do?
Initially, we wanted to just do an overview of the city of Atlanta, and not just Atlanta Public Schools, but all public schools that exist within the zone of Atlanta. So that is the partner schools, that is charters that have their charter through Atlanta Public Schools, as well as any schools that sit within that zone that have a charter through the state, and wanted to see where does quality, based on data, and we can talk a little bit about what quality really means, but where does quality exist, where are there gaps, and what trends do we see?
And the reason I ask that too, because often with researchers, no disrespect, y'all get a lot of information.
It's a lot.
There's a lot of data, and then when it comes time to present it, y'all be lost.
Absolutely.
Because you talk with big words.
Absolutely.
And folks like me are like, I don't get it. So you set out, but then your approach to it, you had to have some metrics that you're going to use, and it's interesting that you use Georgia milestones, which we'll get into that, but I want to back up because I want folks to understand. And by the way, Tiffany has no idea what questions I'm going to ask.
No clue.
No clue. It's just like she in the studio the radio, she's like, I don't know what Rose about to ask me. But so what information were you definitely know you needed to have, and then I want to follow about what information maybe you thought you should have had. So what did you set out to get?
Yeah, so we did use Georgia milestone data from 2022. And I want to just preface, when we're looking at scores today and talking about scores today, we are going to be talking about 2023 preliminary has been released, but we don't have that subgroup data, so just giving you that. If like there's some variance, like I heard this number, that's why. We looked at Georgia milestones, and I focused heavily on literacy. I am a literacy girl. That's the type of work that I've done over the course of my career, and I was also an ELA and English major. Literacy is a great indicator for success in other subjects, so that's why we focused on literacy. But we also wanted to make sure, like you said, I think it's so easy to get into the jargon of education that you forget who your prime audience is. And so for me, it was really important that we didn't just use the milestones data, but that we made that data accessible to all parents.
Well, someone says, well, Tiffany, why would y'all use that given that we're coming off the pandemic, so perhaps there are a whole bunch of circumstances that might not present a clear picture, or it may be a clear picture. Did y'all consider that at all?
Oh, absolutely. I think a national conversation right now is learning loss. If you're in the education space, that is something that comes up all the time. However, when we look at trends over the course of decades, we'd actually see the same trends. So learning loss or not, these conversations are still valuable because before COVID, literacy scores weren't, in my opinion, great. And so knowing that regardless of COVID and the impacts of COVID, kind of everybody it's really unique because it's like one of the first times where everybody, when I say everybody, like the entire nation is, regardless of class, race, gender, is looking at, okay, learning loss. But again, going back to, they weren't that great before, so when we look at it, we're talking about, 10% different. We're not looking at, okay, kids were at 90% proficient and now they're at 20% proficient.
And are there specific grades that would have given a better snapshot than others, or you looked at all the grades here?
We looked at all the grades. When we were looking at Georgia milestones data at the elementary level, we're only talking 3rd grade and 5th grade that are testing grades. In middle school, it's all the grades, and then high school, all the grades.
So I want to back up for a moment because you said there wasn't much of a change given the learning loss during the pandemic, which says to me, wow.
Yeah. It's
even scarier in a sense.
Yeah. And it's really personal to me. I want to name that. I consider myself a lifelong educator. My mother retired this year as a school teacher. And I put faces to all the numbers that I see. I actually had a phone call from a kid that just got out of Wright Street after serving 2 years this week. So I always am thinking about those individual students. And I think it's easy to look at data and be like, oh, it's just data. Mm-hmm. But this data actually impacts individual students, families, but it also impacts everybody in this room because we are Atlanta residents. The students that we graduate tend to stay in Atlanta and be Atlanta residents. You pay taxes, which we all love, right? That go to schools, and so no matter what your investment is in the city, in the school district, these numbers matter.
You mentioned faces behind the numbers because what was interesting, if you could have just gave us a report with a bunch of graphs and charts and data and arrows going this way and then the third, and I would tell my producers to read it because I don't want to read it, but I would read it. But you did something kind of unique though.
Yeah, I mean, as an educator, I've read a million reports, right? And they all kind of say the same thing. I really wanted, and our team really wanted to create a report that was a little bit different. It's not super graph heavy, it's not super number heavy, it's narrative heavy. Mm-hmm. We wanted to show you what does it look like for a student to matriculate through certain clusters of schools through Atlanta based on the data. Now that means we had to make a few assumptions.
Sure.
Because these are hypothetical students, but those assumptions are grounded in data. Those assumptions are also grounded in some of our own experiences as either educators or teachers within the system.
So let's start with Zach.
Yes.
Tell us about Zach.
Zach goes to North Atlanta High School. Well, he starts off, and I apologize because I'm going to forget, of course, the school. I think he starts off at Morningside. No, he starts off at, Morningside Elementary.
Was Garden Hills?
Garden Hills. See,
I read the report, y'all like,
I was just quizzing you right there. Just preface, I got postpartum brain, okay? So if I look at my notes or anything, it's 2 years, I'm only 6 months in, so the brain cells are coming back day by day. Zach starts off at Garden Hills Elementary School, and he struggles with some reading, but his parents are able to get some early interventions. And his teachers also notice, he got a little bit of behavior problems, a little antsy in his seat. And he's also able to get some early intervention there from his teachers through parent-teacher conferences. And they're able to say, okay, he might need some accommodations, needs a little bit of wiggle time, needs a little bit more time to take tests, etc.
But where does Zach live?
Buckhead.
Okay.
Buckhead.
Write that down.
Yeah. And so as he goes through middle school and high school, he has access to advanced courses at North Atlanta High School. They have IB program. They also have, I think, over 20, I want to say 26, it might be 27, advanced placement courses that he's able to take, and he's able to graduate and then enroll at Georgia Tech.
And he gets a scholarship.
Yes, and he gets a scholarship, Hope Scholarship.
All right. Let's talk about Kayla.
Kayla lives on the south side of town. South Atlanta to be exact. Her family struggles financially and has some transportation issues. So they move from one school to the next school, and they even try out one of the APS charter schools, but as some of you may know, going to a charter school can be a good option for students, but a lot of those charter schools don't provide transportation. And if you are a family that doesn't have a car, then transportation might make or break your school experience. And so she was unenrolled and had to withdraw from that school because she wasn't able to be there consistently, and ends up going back to a homeschool. She also struggles with reading as well, but is not given those early interventions, and so that gap gets wider and wider. When she gets to South Atlanta High School, she gets interested in STEM, and so they have a STEM program that she's able to get into, I think as a rising ninth grader interest, but they don't offer, how many people, anybody take calculus in here in high school? Okay. We suffered together. If you know anything about AP Calculus, you can either take the AB course or assessment, a course and assessment, or the BC, which is like the full on thing. Well, South Atlanta doesn't actually offer the BC. They only have the AB. And so when she goes to apply for schools, she realizes that she doesn't actually have all of the necessary tools needed to apply to somewhere like Georgia Tech. And so instead she applies to a local community college where she gets in. But because she graduated with some deficits, specifically in reading, which happens to a lot of our students, she has to take remedial courses in reading, writing, English. That not only puts her behind, but puts her in debt. Anybody familiar? You don't have to raise your hand for that one. Puts her in debt. She's not only taking courses, but also working full-time because she didn't have a scholarship, because her family's not able to provide, and eventually drops out of school and doesn't get a diploma, but the only thing that she has is debt walking away from school.
And I want to back up for a moment because Zach graduates with a job.
Yes.
Already waiting.
A job already waiting, and those small differences are what change, not even small, those big differences are what make really big trajectory changes for our students. And what is important to remember when we talk about access is that these two students are part of the same system. And I think that's what was so jarring for me when I was doing some research on what AP courses were offered to students, that one school could have 26 offerings and another one could have 6. And I'm thinking about, well, what about the kids who actually this would be really good for? What do they do, you know? And yeah.
So different zip codes, different set of quality of life issues for Zach's family and Kayla's, but then some similar challenges they both had, but access to resources to address those for the families based on the school. So what, and I don't like to use the word plague, but whatever impacts the community probably impacts the schools as well.
Absolutely.
That's what you all are saying.
Absolutely. And from my experience, that is very much true.
So there were some factors in there, and y'all can throw them out if I miss one. Housing, transit and mobility, maybe even health and wellness, mental health, and workforce development. You talked about jobs. So I got to tell you, Tiffany, you know, what you all present, it's not new, right? We've heard this before, right? This is not new. So why do we keep seeing this? And so I guess this is where we get into not who's at fault, but where is the missteps?
Yeah, this is definitely not a conversation.
If you want to say who's at fault, go ahead.
No, I don't think there's one individual to blame. So first of all, that's really important to state. And Who I'm not blaming is teachers or schools as individuals. I think it's a systems issue, and I also want to name it's a poverty issue. You will see a lot of our data does talk about race, but when we're talking about race here in Atlanta specifically, well, anywhere really, we're talking not just about race, but the intersection between race and class. So what we know is that poor students perform worse than students who have what they need to go to school every day. I can blame a lot of different systems for poverty, but I think what is really important to focus on, and for me, is to be solution-oriented. So we know that poverty is a major factor for why our students don't do well. So what can we as a system, school board, school administration, do to ensure that we're serving all of our students? What can we do as a city, mayor's office, city council do? And then what can we do as a community, which is all of you, all of your neighbors, nonprofit organizations, partner organizations do? I honestly believe the only way that we can solve these problems is to have that collective effort. If we're trying to do the work in silos, we tend to repeat the same patterns of the past by putting Band-Aids on things. We get a new administration, we get a new curriculum, right? We get a new school board, and we start to see these same kind of 4 to 5 year cycles happen, and I think that is a big reason why we have flatline scores across the board for the last 15 to 20 years.
And before we get into recommendations that you all made in the report, I just want to make sure we're clear on the data, because if anyone has any questions about the data, or if there's a question that I should have asked, feel free, because I think now is the time to talk about it before we get into recommendations and solutions. So does anybody have any questions about the data? Over here.
Yes.
Okay. So the question was, if you're looking at data for third graders and if their scores and reading proficiency were not that great, how do they get promoted to the next grade?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a complex question, and I have some personal opinions about promotion and when that should happen based on research. When we're looking at majority of classrooms reading below grade level, I think it makes it really tricky to talk about promotion, and I think it becomes a hard decision for administrators and teachers to make. I want to first say that I don't think it's an easy decision to hold a student back. I've had students who, when I was teaching 5th grade, who were already almost 12 years old with 10-year-olds who've already been held back a year before, who might even already have some sort of accommodations, who are still struggling to read. And then you're getting into some developmental issues too, which is a big deal. I think from my response to you is that early intervention at K2 is the most effective. Personally, I think all retention should happen in kindergarten and 1st grade to close that gap as soon as possible. I think there's also an opportunity for innovation in solving that problem, where you could potentially have a K 2.0, right, where a select group of students are in a different classroom, basically a different cohort, right, where they're getting the services they need. But to answer your question, I think that, one, parents are also part of that conversation. So administrator can make a recommendation, but parent consent goes into that, and that can be very, very tricky. And there's a lot of nuance in this conversation, so if it feels like I'm not answering the question, it's because there's a lot you have to consider before it's just like yes or no, because not every kid who is behind needs to be retained, and there are some that do.
And something else, I'm going to get your question just a second, sis, but back to Zach and Kayla, because Kayla wasn't able to get into pre-K.
Yes, and back to my early intervention, the state of Georgia has lottery-funded pre-K, but there's not access for every kid still. And pre-K is essential for ensuring that students have prerequisite skills coming to kindergarten. A lot of our parents don't know that kids need to have some type of skills before they come to kindergarten. So if they didn't go to pre-K, you've got children who are coming who are able to identify letters, maybe even letter sounds, write their name, spell their name, identify colors, shapes, etc., where other students are coming and you're teaching them from scratch. So that means that gap existed before they even got to school. Something that I do want to plug, where I think a district is doing a really good job at this, is Gwinnett County Schools has a program called Play to Learn, where all caregivers and children in the district, 0 to 5, get 90 minutes of instruction for free from a facilitator at one of where they would be zoned home schools, to actually learn some of those skills and teach parents how to teach their students the skills they need before they go to pre-K and kindergarten. So that, from a policy example, that could be something that we develop here, that we adopt, that really supports our students who need it.
Absolutely. Back to Data, you had a question?
Before you ask your question, we just have some folks on the live stream, so they are not able to hear unless we have the mic.
Yes, so we're going to give you all mics
I
first.
forgot we were live streamed. Okay.
Okay, I wanted to ask, are we looking at the parents, their educational background, to find out really and truly what's their level of understanding? Because if I miss something that my child doesn't know, maybe I honestly don't get it to begin with, because I probably barely finished high school.
Yes, so I don't have the percentage of students, I don't have that information in terms of data, but what we do know is we have a lot of legacy students within Atlanta, meaning their parents went to Atlanta Public Schools and graduated or didn't graduate, right, from Atlanta Public Schools. And so, and this is tying back into the program I was talking about, I think that the district has a responsibility to do everything they can to reach and educate those parents, to give them the information they need to know where their students are at, because that is true. And one of the things that, and this is a little bit of a criticism, I think, with not just Atlanta Public Schools, but school districts in general, sometimes it's really hard to access information. I found it hard for me doing research, accessing information. Sometimes calling schools is really difficult. People don't pick up the phone, people don't return your calls, so the best thing is like driving to the school and talking to someone to get that information. But if you've got a full-time job, you don't have a car, just think about all the things that would prevent you from doing that. On top of, you may be a product of the school that your student goes to, which I've seen, and you may actually have a distaste or distrust for the system yourself because of how you were treated while you were there. So there are many factors that prevent parents from getting what they need or from having what they need already. And I think that I would love to see very targeted programming towards parents so that they have a better understanding of where their kids want to be. I think there is a narrative that certain parents don't care about their kids and don't care about their students' education, and I think that that is completely false.
Absolutely.
I think everyone is doing what they have to do to survive.
Absolutely. Another question on Data?
Yes, could you please go into expounding a little bit more about the two Atlantas? How is that defined, and how is the impact felt? Is it just talking about North Atlanta High School, Midtown High School versus everybody else? Or where is it coming from? Because you mentioned the economic situation.
I'm glad that you asked that question.
Just part two.
Part two.
Even it's, like you said, it's nuanced. So even within the economic situation, if you talk about South Atlanta schools, different districts and regions like the Mays region and Cascade area have a different economic situation than Carver has a different than Thomasville. So can you just explain that, please?
Yes, and I'm going to have like a little lengthy response on this one. If I could get the slide with the data back up when someone gets a chance, just so people can see that, I think that would be really helpful. So in terms of Two Atlantas, one, I hope that all of you, when you leave here, go to twoatlantas.com and you'll get to read our report that will go into more detail about this. So I know Atlanta Public Schools is celebrating 150 years this year. However, Black students weren't able to go to school until 1961, okay? So we didn't integrate until 1961. I just want that to be sketched into your mind. When we look at the demographics of the city and where we see concentrations of people by race in 1961, and we look at it today, there's not a lot of difference. Segregation is a problem in schools. So we talk a lot about racial differences, which can be one way that you look at how Atlanta is divided, but there's also the intersection with class and income. And so I named poverty being the issue. When we have segregated school systems, what tends to happen is that you get minorities in high concentration poverty areas, regardless if they are impoverished or not. So I live in the Therrell cluster, which, if you're familiar with Southwest Atlanta, there's people who've lived in their home, all my neighbors have lived in their homes and been homeowners for like 60, 70 years, okay? Their grandchildren went to Therrell, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Therrell's scores aren't great when we look at the data, but you'd be like, well, but there's higher concentration of wealth there for Blacks. Yes, but if we take all the Black kids, regardless of income, and put them in one school, that negatively impacts all students. And this is not something I'm making up. There's a lot of research done on poverty, race, and the intersection of that, and outcomes for students. And it's not a race issue, it's a poverty issue. It's a poverty issue, okay? When we're in the city of Atlanta, we have the biggest wealth inequality in the United States. So what does that mean for our kids? It means that they have a lack of access to all the things that we have named. So when we're talking about two Atlantas, we're talking about students on two different sides of town, or multiple schools and a couple of other schools, if we're going to be realistic, who are having two different types of experiences. North Atlanta High School has a PTA foundation that raises a lot of money, a lot of money. If I go to Carver Cluster and ask them what their PTA budget was, they might laugh at me because it's significantly different. Doesn't mean there's less parent involvement, but we do know that dollars translate into access for students. When the pandemic hit, parents who had wealth were able to get their kids tutoring. I know that because I tutored 2 children. What about our kids that parents had to work all day? What were they doing? What about the kids that didn't have internet access and the district had to quickly try to solve for that? And so when we're looking at this report, one of the things I'm like, Atlanta has too many Fortune 500 businesses. We have a $1.66 billion budget. Some of these things should not be issues for all of our children. And that comes down to resource allocation. We have the resources, but how are we intentionally allocating those resources to ensure that all students have access to high quality education? Hopefully that answered. There was a part 2. Where'd you go? Did I say part 2? I don't know if I answered part 2.
You did. It was about the economic disparities even within South Atlanta, like Cascade, Thomasville, Carver.
Perfect, thank you.
And we actually got some questions from the live stream folks that I want us to pull up, and they're specifically about data.
Okay.
We may not necessarily get to all of them, but
We will
one
try our best.
specifically was about data. This first one, why use English language arts scores to determine literacy as opposed to the reading Lexile scores from Georgia Milestones?
Honestly, it was a choice. It was a choice. We can use both and actually see if we're going to get the same information that students are not reading on grade level. Okay. Yeah. It says,
It looks like the last one too is pretty data focused. What about poverty actually affects reading proficiency at the 3rd and 5th grade level? And then how can education systems more aggressively improve this issue?
So the last question is really interesting because I've been reading lots of papers all week to get to the bottom of this question, and the answer is kind of unknown. It's unknown. What is it about poverty? We can make some assumptions, but when they test against some of those assumptions around access, curriculum choice, I'm trying to think of another one that I just read. There's nothing that actually confirms those assumptions. So I personally don't have the answer to what about poverty. I have lots of assumptions about what about poverty. I think some of the things aren't as measurable as we would like them to be, so it's hard to give concrete data or concrete answers as to this is the reason why. But what I can say is that poverty seems pretty stressful. And stress plays a large role into how students show up in school. And my students who had, my students whose families struggled the most, those were the students who also struggled the most in school for a multitude of reasons.
All right. I want to get into recommendations for a moment, but also just before that, you can go back from No Child Left Behind and going on up to Race to the Top and everything in between. There was a time where everybody was using the term, I'm an education reformer. This is what it is. And so we've had all these different initiatives, whether they're federal or local or regional, what have you, but nothing has been working.
Successful.
Right. So now we're getting to recommendations. The first thing you all came up with for particularly Atlanta Public Schools was wraparound services. And I want to be fair because I've covered this district before, and they do put a lot into wraparound services, but there are some specific services and resources that you think need to be amplified or they need to be implemented that aren't there yet.
Yeah, and I do give kudos. I was just on the phone today with someone from the district talking about student houselessness. So there are a lot of different services and a lot of different partner organizations doing great work in Atlanta. There is some policy pieces, though, around wraparound services that we can look at to ensure that we're not missing anybody. Okay. And so I think it was, Anthony, remind me of what district it was that had the tool. Yeah. So in Houston, they have district policy and a tool that they implemented where essentially every single person who touches a student can enter into the system information about that student that provides recommendation for services, and they're able to just see every kid and what they need very, very clearly. So it's not that services don't exist, but it's how are we ensuring that we're meeting the needs and not missing anyone and no one's falling through the cracks. Right now, I think there's about 2,000 students in Atlanta Public Schools that are defined as homeless or houseless, and there you guys can go and look up what that actually means, because it doesn't necessarily mean sleeping out of your car. It could also be doubling up, etc. But my guess is that number is probably even bigger than that. I know when I was doing work in Detroit during the pandemic, there were students that just went missing. They didn't know, they couldn't find them, they didn't know if they went to different schools, moved states. So just finding even better ways and innovative ways for us to track our students collectively across the entire district so we can ensure that they're served.
And then another recommendation was to focus on literacy, which you said is very close to you.
Yes.
But if we're already seeing the reports and trends that say we aren't meeting kids even before they get to kindergarten, so by the time they come into the district, they're already behind. So this seems like this is an area where some of those community or public-private partnerships need to come in, or if there's going to be federal, good look, asking Washington for some money.
Well, I think that there's a couple of solutions we can look at. I think one is looking at the organizations that are actually doing great work already at those levels and seeing how, auditing those services, what are they doing? Is it something that we can scale, expand, put money into? I think that's the first thing. I honestly think I would love for Atlanta to adopt what Gwinnett's doing, because it seems to be working for them. So something like that, where it's an early intervention program, early learning really is what I would consider it. And I think the key to that is that parents part. It's not just kids learning, it's also parents learning so that they can go and do that on their own. You're really building some sustainability there. I think another policy piece is I love that we allow schools to have some autonomy over the curriculum that they're using, but there is science and data behind what works best for students, and so science of reading and ensuring that the curriculum that we're using in K-2 is targeting those really early skills. When kids are in K through 2, they're learning to read. That means they're doing phonemic awareness, in addition to comprehension, vocabulary acquisition, and a whole bunch of jargon, right? They're actually learning individual letters and sounds and putting those together to make words and sentences. By the time they get to 3rd grade, that switches, that transition happens, and they are now not learning to read, they're reading to learn. The problem is if students don't have those prerequisite skills to read fluently and comprehend, they're then no longer getting a lot of that phonics instruction, and that's why we see that gap in 3rd grade just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So ensuring that we have curriculum, and there's several really quality curricula out there, curriculum that is targeting that and is not I'm kind of anti-guided reading, but we're getting into jargon. But anyways, it's really targeting skills-based so students can learn to read appropriately, I think is another piece of policy that we could implement.
And then one of the other ones you all say, let's have school districts adopt restorative discipline practices.
Yeah, restorative discipline practices is where we're not going straight to punitive. We're not going straight to, I'm putting you in the hallway. I was in the hallway, girl. I like to talk. That's why I'm up here today.
I was in the corner of the classroom.
Oh, you were in the corner?
Behind
Yeah.
the teacher. Yeah.
Well, I was there too until they got annoyed with me and put me outside. Don't take us outside. But and girls, being talkative is a sign of intelligence, so, whatever. But really, it's like looking at that, and I'm being funny, but I'm also being serious. Like so many times our little boys specifically, they learn different. They need play, they need movement because of the testosterone they have, but the type of classrooms we have are very much like sit and get and be quiet and shut your mouth, right? And so how are we creating classrooms, especially at those younger grades where kids are able to, I always believe, I don't like a silent classroom because that does not tell me that learning's happening. Learning's happening when I hear kids talking to each other and learning from each other, and it's a collaborative classroom. And then what does discipline look like? Are we jumping straight to suspension, out of school suspension? We look at suspension rates, even though we have 73% black students in the district, out-of-school suspension rates, 89% of those kids are black. And I think that, we can talk about, is that racism, is it not? And to me, that doesn't matter as much as, do we have teachers in the classrooms who are culturally competent? Do we have teachers in the classrooms who are able to engage in conflict resolution? Just like we may hold police accountable for how they de-escalate or don't, teachers need those same skills too. So how are we de-escalating, or am I coming in with my ego? Because as a former teacher, it's easy to be like, because I said so, right? And get in your face. But a lot of our kids shut down like when they get that way, or they do the opposite, and you're hyping them up.
Yeah.
And now that small behavior became a big punishable behavior. So another piece of the policy that we really want to see is outside for like very extreme circumstances, not having students at the elementary school level have out of school suspension. They should be in school. We know that chronic absenteeism is an issue in general in the district, specifically post-pandemic. We know that kids learn when they're in the classroom, so there's no reason that we should be the ones putting them out.
We're going to get some questions in a moment, but something we talked a little bit about, but I want to talk about educators for a moment, because educators are on the, as we call it, the front line. And
Yes.
I hate when some journalists use that front line, because it's like, you're not going to war with these kids. You're there to embrace them and to educate and to empower. Y'all can tweak that if you want. So is it time to, if we haven't already, really reevaluate how we educate the future educators?
Oh my goodness, I'm so glad you said that. Yes. I think and this is not a district level issue, but I think at the School of Education, we need to relook at how we're educating and preparing teachers to be ready to be in the classroom. I think there is a tiny shift that I'm seeing happen, but there needs to be an overhaul. Learning to write lesson plans was not the skill that I needed to be a quality educator. And that's how I spent a lot of my time in college. That plus, we need to professionalize teaching. For some reason, it's like we're not we should be looked at as doctors and attorneys and nurses, and we should be paid like them. I think that if you increase teacher pay significantly, you make teaching a more competitive market, you attract more quality talent, you partner that with really high quality School of Ed programs, you're going to see some differences in instruction in the classroom.
All right, let's get some other questions here. Ooh, a lot.
There's so many questions,
Yeah, let's start here, right here.
Oh, we got a mic coming, so we're going to hold one
We got
second.
mics coming, so hold on.
Up here?
Front row.
Up in front
yeah.
row. Mhm.
Hey, thanks. So you were talking about teacher education, and that makes me think about how in Georgia, professors can't use the word diversity or inclusion or equity when they're teaching teachers to be teachers. And so that the whole process of outline reality, teaching about slavery or other topics that we might find difficult, for me on some level makes me feel like the education system has lost credibility or legitimacy. So that brings me to the question of, as you're looking for solutions, as you've been kind of looking for precedent of what's working, do you see examples where things like, we've got a history here of freedom schools, in our past, where people are doing things outside of the traditional system that are supplementing and offsetting some of the deficits that work?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of many families, not necessarily in Georgia specifically, because I know Florida's doing it, right? Many families, there's people pulling their kids out and homeschooling altogether. But I think what that policy has done is ignited in folks, they have some autonomy. Like, I actually have some power over my kids' education, and I can do something about it. It's obviously tricky because we're talking about also poverty, access, time, right? Can every kid do that? Can every family provide that? Does every family actually have the skill set to do that? I don't know. But what I will say is local elections matter. Local elections matter. Local elections matter. We have the power to vote folks into positions and to make sure that they get out. So that's kind of like the starting point. That was a really great question, and I'm like, I could talk all day about. But we have seen, I don't know what we would call it, but like you said, freedom schools. We have seen parents do that work at the smaller scale. I haven't seen anything large here yet. I also think that in Atlanta we're unique because that might be policy, but some people may not be enforcing it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question
so
back
he
there?
had a question back here, and then after his question, we're going to pull some of the ones up on the live stream because we've been getting a lot of those as well.
Okay.
So has it been determined how effective your early intervention, prevention EIP programs are in these schools that are lower performing, or are they even being done with fidelity?
When you say are you referencing the one I had mentioned earlier that was happening in Gwinnett?
Yes, so the schools here in APS, I know there's the EIP programs for math and for reading, and they started at kindergarten up to 5th grade. So have you all looked at that data to see, one, how effective those students have been as far as showing growth to close those gaps, but then also seeing which schools that are supposed to have EIP funds allocated, but they're actually not even really using it?
So that's a great question, and unfortunately, I'm not able to answer that because I do not have access to that district data. That is a question that I would love for you to direct to one of your school board representatives, because they should be able, and I think we've got some school board representation in here tonight. We just don't have access to the data, so I don't want to speak on anything that I don't have access to.
Was there data that you needed that you couldn't get?
And you did ask that question. Yeah. So we were able to get what the state releases, which is reading, math scores by subgroup, et cetera. We were also the governor's office has a tool where you can look up discipline data, not only by district, but by school, which is actually pretty cool. You should definitely go to their website and look it up. Data only tells so much of the story, and there's only so much that's measurable. So the data that this man mentioned, we don't have access to. I would love to see really what learning growth looks like. We're looking at scores that are just, okay, you got this score, you didn't, but like, what does that kid look like from kindergarten to 5th grade? How much was that school able to grow them over the course of 5 years? That to me matters more, and we just don't have access to learning growth scores. Because sometimes what happens, and what I had seen as a teacher, is if you have students who are coming in behind and then you're only being compared to other schools where kids are behind, it looks like you may not be doing anything. It looks like your kids aren't doing that well, but if you're able to grow a student 2 grade levels in 1 year and they're still behind grade level, that actually can tell you a lot more about what's being effective. So growth scores, I think, are incredibly important data to look at.
This question here, does focusing on race affect the formulation of solutions that fail to address the entire problem? That's a good question. Interesting question.
It's an interesting question. I would say it's probably a yes. It went away. I would say that it's possibly, I think it's a yes and, because we're talking about intersection. So focusing on race in terms of looking at data may not be problematic, but if we're focusing on race as the only, solving for racial injustices is the only solution, then I think that would be problematic. I think we have to look at race and poverty. I think if we don't talk about poverty, we are not going to solve any of the problems specifically in our city. Because again, 73% of our students are Black. So we need to look at why is it some students are performing well and some are not.
There were some questions in the audience too. I want to get to some folks who haven't asked a question. Let's go.
He had his hand up for a really long time.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'm trying to be equitable.
How y'all doing? Good evening. My name is Michael Driver, a product of Atlanta Public Schools by way of Brown Middle School, Mays High School. And I think my question is, I taught for 9 years, I taught in New York for 4, then I came back here to Atlanta, and what was interesting was paying attention to like reading. What my students were reading in 5th grade, in Atlanta they don't read till 7th and 8th grade. So when I think about like recommendations and policy, it's twofold. Including teachers and then including just the experience of allowing students to be active participants in this type of like conversation. What are your thoughts about these type of events with educators strategically hearing these thoughts and getting these thoughts across, and then also students and parents? Because I think one of the biggest issues is they're not a part of this journey. Like, we're having this discussion about students who are very aware, i.e. when I was in 3rd grade, the challenge bus. I already recognize that I'm not gifted by way of the idea that I'm not on the challenge bus. Think about other students who are aware of these challenges. What's your thoughts about experiences for them to be able to covet fighting back with us while we're having this discussion about them?
Yeah, what I hear you saying is that parents and students need to be a part of this conversation, and we 100% agree with you. I think the heart of our organization is about community organizing, and so we do actually work with a partner organization, Atlanta Thrive, that focuses heavily on working with parents. All of our events are open, and I'm going to take that back and think about what additional programming we can do in the future to ensure that we're putting students at the center of these conversations. Because you're right, I remember moving from one school to the next school when I was from kindergarten to 1st grade, and like being in a remedial reading class, which I'm from Indiana, which I do think was about race, honestly, but being like, wait a minute, I know why am I learning my letters again? But I'm being so aware at 6 years old that, that's why I'm also not a big fan of tracking, because kids are smart. Like, they know what the blue group is, they know what the dolphin group is, they understand, instead of like constantly doing progress monitoring where students should be working homogeneously and heterogeneously within the same class period so that they have the opportunity to teach and learn from each other as well as get that small group intervention. But ultimately, I do think that they should be a part of our conversations, and that is the intent.
Okay. Can we get the questions from folks up here in the front, please, because they've had their hands up for a minute?
Yeah.
Ask you if you can stand when you ask your questions. Sorry, the folks on the live stream.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello, Dr. Brown.
Hey, y'all. I am Dr. Karita Brown. I'm a professor of sociology at Emory University, and I teach on racial inequality in education. So I
yes.
really appreciate this conversation tonight, and I'll be brief because I have a remark and a question. The remark is, as I look at the wonderful infographic that you all have produced, when I see that Black children are being suspended at a rate of 9 times that of non-Black children, race absolutely matters, and being Black matters. So that anti-Black racism piece is so central and important to the analysis, although I totally agree with you that it's intersectional and it must be looked at alongside class. But naming that being Black in this system matters a lot. And with that, that's where my question lies. I look back a lot to the Black radical tradition when we didn't have so much choice as Black folks of what schools we went to due to segregation. And we did cultivate our own Black pedagogies around teaching our own kids. And we can look back here in the state of Georgia, just with like Lucy Craft Laney and other educators like Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois and Mary McLeod Bethune, who not only founded schools, but cultivated a specifically Black cultural pedagogy to embrace our children. And while that tradition came out of necessity, I wonder if there's a way to consider culture when we think about yes, the data and the numbers, but what also can we draw back to from our own traditions that have worked for us in the past to help us get where we're going?
I don't think of that as a question. I think of that as a call to action. And I think that's a bigger proposition to our system. How do we ensure that we're bringing in those cultural aspects to our students here, specifically in the city of Atlanta? So I really appreciate your remarks because I think you're 100% true. I think the difficulty is with the political climate. How do people do that safely? And I can speak for myself. I did what I wanted to do in my classroom for what I needed to do for my Black children because I knew that my parents were cool. My relationships are there. What happens here stays here. I'm going to teach you about those things, but not all educators feel safe, particularly right now, doing that. And so I think that is a larger political issue that has, again, a lot of nuance, but also what is the policies within Atlanta Public School to protect teachers who are doing what they think is best for students to make sure that they're meeting them where they are. Because I also want to say, I'm sorry, this is so connected to that. We're talking about data, and kids can't read and all these things. This data does not represent the intelligence of our students.
Yes.
It's a measure. It's a measure. And it's a measure that gives us some information, but it doesn't give us all the information, and I do recognize that, and it's always tricky for me in this position, because like we want our work to be grounded in data, but I also know that so many of our students have skills that go beyond just the testing that they do, and so I also wonder, how do we ensure that we're giving students opportunity to show off those intelligences, as we've seen defunding happen from arts education. Again, APS teacher, former APS teacher here, it's like reading math. So if you got a class all day and they're focused, and you teach 3rd or 5th grade specifically, you don't care as much about science and social studies. You don't care about those electives as much because you're being held accountable for something else. And I think a big part of what we're seeing in decline in student test scores is the lack of the cultural piece, but also the arts education, the play, and all the things that make kids like want to go to school and remember the information. I'm not the expert on like the brain, but I know there's a lot of research around students' ability to do well in school, art and music education, especially like it's Atlanta, like music and art, we're really gonna, we're not gonna emphasize those things. That is where we excel in the city. And so I think that's just tied into what you're saying is super, super important.
Absolutely. I want to get a question up here front too, because,
Yes.
thank you so much. Good questions, y'all. Over here.
Reminder to stand if you can.
Hi. So actually, to piggyback on that thought process, I was born and raised in Atlanta. Southwest Atlanta, as a matter of fact, and could have been a Kayla, but ended up a Zach. Okay? Shout out to FAMU. Didn't go to Georgia Tech, but that's okay.
Hey.
Right? But it was because of just what you said. It was because of the innovation. It was because that my mother was innovative. It was because that we had a magnet program for high school that we could pick and choose our passion, and we went to that school. Now, certainly all of my peers didn't have that, right? Because you just couldn't do it. Every child couldn't do it, but most children did. They got to pick their pathway. My question is that where do you see innovation or a lack thereof? I'm also a parent of a high schooler here in the district, and I am floored at the lack of innovation for high schoolers that are literally stuck in their cluster, that they can't go anywhere else, they can't expand anywhere else, and literally where you live is where you're going to go to school, period, point blank, unless you go to a charter or a private school. So, I was just wondering, do you see it? What does data say? Or is that where we really need to focus? Because it seems like the lack of innovation is suffocating our kids.
Suffocating, such a great word to use there. Well, I think we have some data points. I think, 15,000 kids on a charter school wait list tell us that parents are looking for something else. It doesn't mean that I think charter is the answer, but it is not the traditional high school within their cluster. I do agree with you. If we have billions of dollars, we've historically had more money than the city of Atlanta's budget up until this year. The innovation should not be something that doesn't exist within our district. I love that you brought this up because that was my thought process around the AP. Like, we have Zoom, we have all these things. These kids can't sit in on these AP classes on the north side of town. We can't maybe make those courses somehow be centrally located where once a week, twice a week, you're getting bused somewhere. I think there's an incredible amount of opportunity for us to be innovative. And to be honest, everyone's eyes are on Atlanta. Atlanta influences everything when it comes to politics, when it comes to music, when it comes to film. Everyone's eyes are on us. Everyone is taking from this city. How are we ensuring when they come to this city and get what they want, that we're also getting something that we need on the back end to make sure that all of our kids have access to innovation? I mean, between Delta, Microsoft, Google, I could go Coke, we should not have an issue with innovation and access for children. There's so many, I have a million ideas, but not the time and place for that, but 100%, I think there are ways for us to be more creative.
I think we have time for one more question.
So can we do one more in person and then one on the live?
Yeah, sure, one and one.
Yep.
So I love that you talked about the corporate responsibility that these Fortune 500 companies have. I'd like to also point a question at the educational institutions, because I went to Georgia Tech, and I, in my cohort, created Outreach SAT Prep, Leadership for Tomorrow, Tomorrow's Luminaries Foundation, Black Kids Can Learn, and we had little to no administrative support. I mean, we were full-time students trying to get our engineering degrees, but also give back to the APS community. And the institution was not held accountable in any way, shape, or form. Neither was the AUC, neither was Georgia State, or any of the colleges in the Atlanta area. And I mean, they're literally in the city of Atlanta. So how do we hold these institutions accountable for their role? I know when I was at Georgia Tech was in hot water because you could count on one hand the number of APS grads that were at Georgia Tech. We all knew who they were. Like, I could name names, but I won't. But like one from, at that time, Grady High School. In my cohort, there was one from Mays High School, and then that was it. And then a few years later, there was one other student who came from Centennial. He was the first student from Centennial. But Georgia Tech, Georgia State, AUC have no accountability for education in Atlanta. It's very strange to me. So just like you talked about Delta and other corporations, what about the educational institutions that are here as well?
Again, that feels like an idea, and versus a question. So I agree with you. I think that, our belief at Equity in Education is that it takes a village. So when I think about the village, it's not just that community, it's not just the administration and the system, but it's all parties, all partners, every nonprofit, every corporation. So that is something that I would actually pose to whoever the new administration will be. We are in, for those of you who may not know, a superintendent search to see how are they engaging not only with the city of Atlanta. I would also love to see just a better relationship between the mayor's office and the administration. I think we have a unique opportunity right now with Mayor Dickens to do that, but also with those educational institutions that you named. But I think the responsibility for that actually is on the school administration to build those partnerships and hold them accountable.
I like this question here. What does successful wraparound care inside and alongside schools look like to a former educator?
Ooh, this is great. So I think the first thing that I want to talk about is housing. I think that is a major issue right now, and we can't have this conversation without talking about housing, because housing price, I bought a house last year, housing prices are crazy. And what is that? What's the impact of that on our school communities? We know a lot of the project housing over the last 10, 15 years have been closed. Thomasville closed, Four Seasons closed. So where are our kids going? Are they going to Clayton County? Where are they getting pushed to? As we see housing initiatives in the mayor's office has been a big push, if you've been paying attention, happen. The one question I asked former board chair Courtney English last week was, so are y'all working with Atlanta Public Schools to ensure families in Atlanta and the 2,000 homeless families have access? Like, what is the partnership there? If we're doing things in silos, it just doesn't work. That's, again, going back to it takes a vision. So what is the utopia of wraparound services? It's making sure that no food deserts exist within our school communities. It's making sure that we have public libraries in those school communities if they don't exist already. It looks like ensuring that all APS students can ride MARTA for free. Most major metropolitan cities allow their students to ride public transit for free. What are we doing? It looks like increasing the number of school counselors in schools so that they can be effective at their job, because their caseloads, especially in the schools that have higher poverty, are just too high. It's making sure that nobody goes without a meal every night. It's making sure that we have free lunch for all of our kids, which I actually think we've done a pretty good job of. But those are the types of things when we're talking about wraparound. It's like, what does every kid need from the moment that they wake up to they go to bed that our schools can support and provide? Do we have quality after-school care? So thinking about all of those things, that's what full wraparound services would look like.
And I want to add too, before we wrap up, because you don't have to be embedded in the school system per se. You can be a mentor. I got about 8,000 kids across the country. Mentor. I was a summer camp counselor. I mentor if you can. Give a summer internship to a kid. That goes a long way. It really does. And so, Tiffany, as we begin to wrap up, what does this conversation look like, I don't know, 5 years from now? Are we still going to have Zach's and Kayla's and those same optics that keep them on different paths?
Well, 5 years is enough time to have some statistically significant change. I think that implementation, we know that when we're doing like district-wide change management and implementation, it takes 3 to 5 years to actually see statistically significant change. So in 5 years, I would hope that this conversation is, look at what we talked about in 2023 and see how far we've come and grown, and us talking about all of the programs and the things that you all have brought up in this room actually being implemented. I don't think we will be at utopia in 5 years because we need to be realistic, but we should be able to measurably see change, not only in graduation rates, but also with our literacy scores, with our homeless numbers, with our attendance numbers, et cetera. And that's the hope that I have.
All right, so it's an old proverb, cliche, whatever, but it really does take a village. Now more than ever.
And honestly, I believe the community is the biggest form of resistance that you can have. And so our goal is that we can be in community together, even when we disagree on some of these nuances, when we disagree on how we should do it, that we all have that same North Star in ensuring that we're putting students at the center.
Tiffany, thank you so much. Where can folks access this report?
Yes, toatlantas.com. I think it's behind me. Oh, it's not anymore, but it's simple, on purpose. Toatlantas.com, you'll be able to see the report. You're going to see some other things coming from us in the near future. We have a data tool that will be released soon that you will be able to go and look at your cluster, your neighborhood, and be able to see all the schools that exist there, what their data looks like, et cetera. And we're going to be updating that every year, so provide that for you, the community, because we really want all of our families to be active participants in their students' education. So thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. Thank you, Tiffany, for this enriching conversation. Thank you all for being here. The conversation is not stopping here. We're going to continue the conversation over the next, how many ever times we get together. But we're in community with each other. Thank you all for being here, and have a good night. Oh, don't forget to vote. Yeah, sorry, this is Michaela.
I gave almost all of y'all pledge cards when you walked in, and so I will be collecting them at the door, so you can find me at that check-in table. I hope you will cast your vote. Early voting ends November 3rd, but if you like to wait on Election Day, that's cool too. November 7th is Election Day, and so don't just vote, but also remind your friends to vote, because you know at least 3 people who may be waiting till Election Day, like yourself, and so by taking our pledge, you could also pledge to remind your friends. Thank y'all.